So probably a few of you recognize me since I spent the last 6 years of my life here. So I'm Pola and I'm going to talk to you about history extension today. So I'm actually going to take a slightly different approach to Caitlin. So she kind of broke down the exam for you, talked about all the different sections individually. But what I found with history extension is that all of the different sections are actually quite related to each other in different ways. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about like long-term study techniques, you know, the attitudes you need to have to the course, the major work, and also break down the exam for you a bit and talk about the ways to tackle those two really big essays. What you're doing here is not talking about the past or well, I mean it is, but like you're not analysing what happened in the past insofar as you're analysing big historical events. What you're actually looking at is the way that we construct history and the way that we've understood where we came from and how we should learn where we came from and communicate where we came from over a couple of thousand years. It's also really important to love history because you need to be able to motivate yourself for that major work. So the major work is a huge component within the course because internally that's 80% of your mark. And you're going to need to be able to make yourself sit down and research and choose your topic and refine your question and write your essay and edit and get feedback. So it really is quite a big endeavour and you're going to make it a lot easier for yourself if it's something you actually want to be doing. And it's also a good idea to have good time management because even though it's just a 1-unit subject, as I'm sure all of you doing extension are starting to realise or have realised by this point, there is quite a lot of content in there as well, and externally you're only being assessed on the content that's in the exam. So as well as the major work, in the exam you're going to be asked, what is history? Which is a pretty complicated question, and you're also looking at a case study, so there's quite a lot more to the course than most people seem to think there is before they start. Okay, so how to study for extension? So extension isn't really a subject that you can cram into the night before the exam or the week before the HSC starts or anything like that, because so much of it is knowing what you actually think about history and having strong opinions and being able to back that up with historical evidence. So it is quite a long-term process. And what you'll probably find, not just with extension but with all your subjects, is that over the course of year 12, you get tested on the same things in quite a similar way quite a few times. And I know that there are some people who get their essay back. Some people don't even look at their mark. Some people will look at their mark and then just put it face down and never look at it again. That's a really bad idea. Because if you don't actually look at what you wrote, then you're never really going to know where you went wrong if you've made a mistake, and you're not going to be able to improve from it. So it's a really good idea to learn from the feedback that you get, not just for history extension, but for everything. And honestly, in the long term, that's going to help you improve so much more. Because what you're working for, like all the way through year 12, isn't just like each exam result on the way, it's the bigger picture. It's that, that final HSC result and ultimately the ATAR that will get you into whatever you want to do later on. I would also say that listening to your teachers is super important because these people here are amazing. Like they know what they're doing, and sometimes I remember during year 12 being so stressed, not knowing what to do with an exam, or like not even being able to study because I just couldn't like make myself focus. I was so agitated. And so I would just kind of write ranty emails to Miss Bav. And by the end of writing the email, I felt so much better. So Miss Bav is a history. The other thing that's really important is to work together. So I found that because history extension is a topic where there is no one right answer, like every interpretation is totally valid so long as you can support that. So if you talk to each other about what you think and you listen to people's ideas and you debate and you like help each other learn, then you're going to, in the end, have a much stronger understanding and a much deeper understanding of the course. So, like, you know, you're surrounded by other people who are learning the same things that you are, and if they have a slightly different interpretation, they probably have some reason for that. So it's actually a really good way to strengthen your knowledge. I'd also suggest that throughout the year, as you go through those assessments on the same thing over and over, each time try and condense your notes down. So you might start, I know that the way that we did it was starting with a worksheet for each historian with broad questions on their approach to history, what they thought about different historical themes, at least for the what is history component, and quite similar for the case study as well. And then I found that as the year went on, I knew quite a lot about what historians thought, and I started to know what information I thought actually related to the themes and what information I agreed with or disagreed with that I was going to bring up in my essays in the exam. So I was able to condense my notes down and make them really specific and directed to the things that I saw as important to what is history. I also found that writing practice essays, or at least practice essay plans, on as many different questions as you can is really helpful, because when you're in that exam situation, you're going to be pretty stressed and it can be hard to kind of formulate your thoughts. So if you've already done an essay that was vaguely similar or on a similar theme, then you've already thought through those things, and it's going to be a lot easier to come up with an argument to fit the question in this particular exam. I'd also suggest just like keep working on your time management in the exam through doing like timed papers and things like that, and in the end that'll help you so much. But really what it comes down to is that long-term process, so that you can come up with a really strong view of what you think about history and how you want to tackle it in the exam. So such a big component of history extension is that major work, and that's generally the reason why people tend to choose the course. So I'll just talk about mine as an example. So I thought I wanted to choose something that I was going to be interested in and willing to keep talking about and writing about and learning about, which I think is really important because, you know, you need to be able to motivate yourself. So I chose the dancing plague of 1518, which was basically this phenomenon in the Middle Ages where about 400 people in Strasbourg just started dancing, and they couldn't stop, and they just kept dancing to the point that they started like having strokes from the overexertion and dying. And then eventually, like, the town authorities tried all these different things to cure them, and eventually they like took them to this shrine and made them dance around a shrine to this saint, and then they were fine. So I thought that was a pretty interesting historical fact. Like, this is an actual thing that happened. And I realized that a lot of historians had very different views on why. So the approach that I took was just to look at all of these different historians' views and try and understand why they'd come up with that particular approach and what were the strengths and the weaknesses of their theories, and like just sort of evaluating the different approaches that historians take and why they take those approaches was kind of the underlying historical theme. And it was something that I was really interested in. Like, I think, I was willing to go to State Library and sit there with a big pile of books, going through them all and writing notes. And that's really important. And the other thing is that because this is something that you can refine, you actually need to start it early. So when are you guys handing in your major works? Week 10? Okay, and honestly, who started? Okay, cool. That's really good news. Yeah, so it's good to have some kind of plan, like this week I'll read through this source, this week I'll read through this source, or like this week I'll kind of assemble what my different arguments are going to be through my essay, because it is quite a long-term process. So what I did was just read a whole bunch of different historians. I kind of whittled it down to I think 3 or 4 who had very, very different ideas about why these people danced uncontrollably until they died. And then I came up with a thesis of what I thought actually caused the dancing plague. And then I started by doing an essay plan. So this was something I did for modern as well, and for the exam essays. I would write a plan where I'd write an introduction, I'd have topic sentences, and I would have my conclusion. But below each topic sentence, I would just have dot points of what I was going to write in that paragraph. Like, so statistics, quotes, key ideas, things like that. And once you've got that, it's really easy to just sit down and turn it into an essay. So that was my approach, and that's what worked for me, although of course different things might work for different people. And then once I had that draft, I showed it to Miss Bav quite a few times, went through it with her, which is, like, as I was saying earlier, listen to your teachers. If they, like, they're the ones who are marking it, so you want it to be something they think is good. So if they tell you that you need to do something in particular, just do it. I also did things like I read it out loud and listened to myself read it to kind of figure out which sentences sounded clunky, which things didn't quite make sense, and just making that argument flow. And it worked pretty well for me in the end. So yeah, I would recommend just, you know, get as much feedback as you can, keep refining that essay, keep coming back to it. Like, you know, you can look at it too many times, sure. And sometimes you might just need a break to sort of think about something else so that you can come back to it with fresh eyes. But ultimately what it comes down to is just hard work and working over quite a long term to get that final product. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the actual exam. So the exam for History Extension is a 2-hour exam with 2 different essays in it. And it can be quite stressful for some people. So this here is an actual post from the HSC discussion group the night before the History Extension exam. I hope that guy went okay. So the 2 essays you have to write are what is history and your case study. And really, these are both things that you could talk about forever. Like, there is so much to say on each topic. So you really need to work on just managing your time so that you get through both essays in those 2 hours. So my approach was to start with the case study. So the case study that we did was convict women. So is everyone doing History Extension yeah, okay, cool. So everyone who's doing History Extension here knows what I'm talking about. So with all the case studies, it's going to be over some kind of historical debate. And you really can kind of condense it down to quite clear arguments. So at least for convict women, what we had was the contemporary views on them, and then post-World War I revisionist views, and then we had the kind of reactionary return to conservatism in the 1950s in the way people thought about the convicts, and then we had feminist historiography, and then we had post-feminist and post-structuralists. So there were these very, very clear, distinct phases in the historiography. And the way that you need to tackle the historical debate is just to make sure that you're talking about all those different phases. Because if you leave something out, then you're not really being honest about, you know, the way that the history has been constructed. So what it comes down to is being able to talk about all of those things in an hour. And being able to formulate your argument so that you're not just saying, well, here's what one bunch of historians thought, and then here's what another bunch of historians thought, but actually looking at the question and looking at the quote that you're given and thinking, okay, how does this apply to the case study overall and to each school of historical thought? So that's why it's so important to spend some time planning in the exam. I found that the case study was quite a long essay to write because there's so much to cover. So I generally only gave myself about 5 to 10 minutes. But what you need to do is figure out how the quote applies and then quickly think about each of those historical schools and how you're going to tweak what you know about each of those sections of the historical debate to fit the question. And once you've done that, you can just kind of sit down and write your essay and get it all out there. And just, you know, make sure that you keep focused and don't go off on tangents about things that might be interesting but aren't really all that relevant to the question. So then hopefully you get that done in an hour or a little bit over an hour, and you can turn to what is history. Now this was the part of the course, I mean, I love doing the major work, but I also found this incredibly interesting. So it is a lot of work learning, what did historians think over about a 2,000-year period of time from Herodotus, who was essentially the start of the Western historical tradition, right through to the present day with, post-structuralist history and postmodernist history and post-postmodernist history, because it just keeps going. So with what is history, you get a pretty substantial source. And there's going to be, and whoever's written this source is probably going to have quite a lot to say, and they do tend to be quite dense. So what I recommend doing is look at the question first before you look at the source, so you know what you're actually looking for in the source. So if you get a question that's about, to what extent can we find truth in history, then you immediately know that, okay, so this essay needs to be about, is there historical truth, and, the possibility to actually come up with an objective history. So then, once you know which things you're talking about, you can go back and start reading the source, and as you go through, you can pinpoint where that author has expressed their opinions on this and what they're saying are the important facts relating to that particular debate in history. So yeah, read the source really closely. Once your 5 minutes reading time are up, you can kind of go and highlight through the source. So I actually went through and read this source before I went to the case study, and then came back to it after I'd written my case study essay and refined my argument and planned my essay. And yeah, so once you've gone through the source, you figured out what they think, and of course you also know what you think. You need to decide what historical or historiographical evidence you're going to use to support your argument. So it's all about what you personally think and the way that you feel, or at least that you understand history. So no one's essay is going to be at all alike. But you will find that, throughout the different exam blocks, you might find that you're using quite similar historians each time, or similar historical debates as kind of the focus for each of your paragraphs. So I found that one historian who I used quite a lot was Simon Sharma, who has done quite a lot of popular history type stuff, he has documentaries and things like that, and he has quite a lot to say on, making history something that's actually relevant to people and something that's accessible to people. And the reason I think that I used him so much is that I actually agree with what he says about history. So I would often use him as my final paragraph. So I would discuss a couple, maybe a historical debate that was relevant to the theme, or a couple of other historians who had very different views. So a good one is always von Ranke, because he's such a marker of change in the way his history was constructed in the 19th century. Do include those different perspectives, and don't do it chronologically, because that's not what they're asking you for. They don't want to know how did what people think about historical truth change over time. That's what the case study's about. It's about that over time change. This one's just looking at the different approaches and whittling it down from let's look at this extreme to let's look at this extreme to here's the balance, here's what I think. Or at least that's one way that you can approach it. So really what it comes down to is know what you think, make sure you're engaging with that source and include that source. So you include quotes, reference what the source says, and it should be like a conversation between you and the source, using different historians and different historical debates as the evidence in each of your paragraphs. So whereas in modern your evidence might be quotes and statistics and historical facts and this battle happened in this year with this many casualties, here this is the way that a historian has approached this, here are the flaws and here are the good things about their approach. So it is a very complex topic, and especially considering that is half of the content and really is only accessible externally. Internally it's 10%. So it is a lot, but I think it's actually really rewarding if you invest the time into getting a really good understanding of what is history and the ways that different people have conceived of it. And that's what's going to get you those marks in the end. So in terms of other tips for getting through the HSC, I just want to make a note of saying that, like, you know, obviously both Caitlin and I did work really hard throughout Year 12, but you also need to be kind to yourself and make sure that you are giving yourselves a break. So, like, you know, you might find that something you really miss is, I don't know, making brownies. So you might be like, all right, I'm going to get home from school, I'm going to make a batch of brownies, put them in the oven, and then I'm going to go and do my history readings. And then by the time the brownies are finished cooking, I will have done these 2 readings and then I can eat one as a reward. So just find ways to integrate the things that you enjoy and the things that keep you sane into the studying that you ultimately are going to have to do. And also just find ways to de-stress, like during those few weeks before the HSC and before trials, and even after exams, sitting at home trying to study for the next one. Sometimes I would find that I just couldn't concentrate because, like, it is a really stressful process. So what I did was I would just, like, get up and go for a walk to the dog park near my house, look at all the dogs, and then I just felt a lot happier, and I could, like, go back, be a bit refreshed, and actually ultimately study a lot better. So yeah, and also don't worry if you're, like, stuffing up one assessment. Like, that's not really going to make that big a difference in the end. Like, you know, I think in Year 11, I was kind of bang in the middle of the grade for modern history. And then I ended up doing really, really well in both modern and extension. So it's really just about, like, you know, if you stuff up or if you didn't do as well as you hoped, then just treat it as a learning experience because you can always come back for it. And even, like, I remember one exam in Year 12 for modern, I was really disappointed with my results. But in the end, it didn't matter because I just learned from my mistakes in that assessment, worked hard to correct them, and in the end, it really paid off. So, yeah, I guess the take-home message is just, like, keep working hard in the long term, but don't, like, let the study completely take over your life. Like, you know, in Year 12, you do get a lot of other opportunities, so make sure that you make the most of them and take those opportunities while you're at school and while they're available to you. So, yeah, I hope that was helpful.
In terms of making notes, how do you think is the best way to go about it, like in your experience?
So what I did for modern was, I basically read through the textbook before, or whatever resource you're using, before we covered it in class, that I had a broad idea what was going on. Went into class, heard what my teacher had to say about it, and then I had some dot points, but I think the most valuable study resource you can have is essay plans. Yeah. Because knowing heaps of facts isn't necessarily useful for modern if you can't put that into an argument.
Yeah, so I didn't read things before we covered them in class. But what I did with my notes was structured everything according to the syllabus, because that's where all the questions are going to come from. So if you know kind of like what you need to know in relation to each syllabus dot point, then when it does come to making those essay plans, which is definitely the most useful thing you can do, you're kind of going to already know what needs to be in them. And yeah, it will just translate to better essays.
Yeah, we seem to have had the same study plan by having like intros, written topic sentences, and then some dot points of evidence.
Yeah.
Does your major work get externally marked?
No.
No.
So the major work is 40 out of the 50 marks internally, and externally it's just the exam. Yeah.
In terms of studying for things, how do you remember everything? Like, what things you did?
Okay, so I don't know if you've ever heard anyone say that teaching is the best way to learn, but it actually is. So what I did was get all my notes or my note summaries, and then I made my parents sit down and I taught them the entire course. They were very long-suffering.
Yeah, I reckon just talking about it with your friends and like getting angry about how they feel about history, getting angry about like, your own ideas, and then getting passionate about it, like you're never going to forget, like if you can argue about it.
There is a lot of anger.
Yeah, I was so emotionally invested. I just bring back all these emotions. And I guess coming back to like remembering things, pick things like historiography-wise, that you agree with and that you think are enjoyable or entertaining, because that'll help you remember it.
And yeah, and by the time you've done your modern exam like 3 times over the course of the year, or your extension exam, you kind of do start remembering things. Like, I remember it feels really overwhelming at first, but when you get to the end, like especially after having that 3 week StuVac just before the HSC, where you have 3 weeks to just revise, like once you've gone over things enough times, they do start to stick in your head.
And you won't forget it, ever.
For history extension, like approximately how much would you do? Like, would you set dates for yourself? I mean, would you set goals for yourself along with all the homework coming in from your other subjects? Like, how many words would you write every day, or how much would you refine every day?
So like over the course of the year?
Yeah, like for your major work.
Well, for my major work specifically. I'm just trying to think what I did. I think over the summer, I kind of had like sort of started researching, so I kind of knew what the resources were that I was going to use, and I started to like read them over the course of term 1 when I had time. And then I find that I work really well when I have a deadline. So I think at one point Miss Bav said that we needed to have drafts done at a certain date, and no one else took that seriously. But I did. I was like, oh, okay, I better just sit down and write it. And then I did. I don't know, I think it's about just getting into the right mindset. So I find that once I'm kind of like thinking about the topic and I'm kind of invested in it, I can just sit down and write. But it kind of, sometimes it takes me a while to like get there. So, sorry, that's probably not a very helpful answer, but I think it's just like, you know, don't leave it to the last minute just because you have other homework coming in. Like you might, if it works for you to break it down, you could just be like, okay, this week I'll do my introduction, next week I'll do this paragraph, and like do it like that. But it's really kind of what works for you in terms of study habits.
I had another answer to the question about memory. I watched a lot of documentaries during year 12 related to modern, particularly about the personality study, because it was sort of like a lazy way of studying. Like you didn't actually have to do anything except watch it. But when you watch documentaries that have like terrible acting in it, or like they use just bad historiography, or they're overly simplistic, like you're going to remember that, and you'll find that when you watch movies that have historically related things in them, you'll identify what they are. Like for example, in The Sound of Music, like I never really understood why Father Von Trapp got so angry about like the flag, but then after I did modern, I learned, and then that was one of the ways that helped me remember, which sounds ridiculous. But yeah, like watching things definitely helps.
Yeah, so just going off that, so I think Caitlin was saying that about Lenny, like it's a good idea to, you know, watch her documentaries. I think just before one exam block, I like looked up, what's it called, Olympia on YouTube, and I just started watching, and it actually was really helpful because watching this, I actually understood like how powerful it was as propaganda, because I got really into it. I was like, whoa, the Olympics are amazing. And then I realized I was watching Nazi propaganda. Yeah. So yeah, make study interesting for yourself.
In terms of breaking down the exam question, how would you, like, because you have a lot of information from obviously the notes you've done, how would you be able to allocate it that you have a structure for the response?
Yeah.
I think it's about coming up with a logical argument.
Yeah, having the argument first, and then sorting,
And then information.
out.
So don't look at the question and think, oh, which facts do I throw at this? Look at the question and think, okay, what is the actual answer to this question? And then use the facts as the evidence to support the argument that you construct.
And often it's helpful if you, with answering your questions in like chronological order, sometimes it's best if you don't do that. Don't be all over the place, but if you're talking about different factors, so that you don't just give a narrative response, start with what's most important, what you think is the biggest answer, and then go from there, so that way you're not giving a narrative, which is what the markers don't want.
And just break it down into themes as well. Like, if you're talking about the impact of something, then you can talk about like political, social, economic. And then once you've got that kind of structure, it's pretty easy to figure out like which bits of historiography and which facts need to fit into those different paragraphs to support that argument.
The economy is really important in modern history.
For extension history, for the what is history question, in finding like relevant substantiation outside of a historian study, did you just like, when you're like watching TV, like, oh, I could use that, or like, did you specifically go out to find other like things you could use?
Really, I mostly just used the resources that we were given in class because it was very comprehensive. But I think like if there is a historical debate that you're interested in, then it's definitely worth looking into, because when it comes to what is history, like the articles that you see in the media are completely relevant, like especially I guess at the moment with things about like the Anzac centenary. That was something I actually talked about in the HSC, like discussing, you know, the way that our conception of Anzac has changed over time, and like I did refer to like the way that the media talks about it now. So if you read the newspaper or watch the news or any of that, then like, yeah, if you see anything relevant, it's definitely worth taking a note. Yeah.
For extension history, like you know how the essay times aren't as like substantial as like the modern because the questions really like weird, like all the time. So like when you went into the extension history, like did you take in like what exactly was it that you took in like in terms of your notes like before the exam? Because there's so much to cover.
So I think the way that I did it was I started like throughout the year kind of had notes on all these different historians, which is just something that you'll do in class. And I went by the structure that Miss Bav gave us, so like looking at the historian's context, then looking at their approach to history, their ideas about history, and like criticisms. So I kind of had all that, but then when it came towards the exams, it's much easier if you think about the themes. So if you can be like, all right, so one theme is historical truth, or like or the audience of history, like who is history for? Then you can be like, okay, so here's a few opposing views that I know about, and like this historian thinks this historian thinks this, and then just decide what you think. Like, I think at a few points throughout the year, I would just start writing a big rant about like what I thought about history, what I think it's for, like what are the good things, what are the bad things about it. And so just like having those opinions in my head was probably the most useful thing, because it meant that as soon as I read that giant source in the exam, I was like, yep, I agree with that, no, don't agree with that.
All right, ladies, I just wanted to thank you on behalf of Sydney Girls High School History Teachers Association, and just thank you for all the resources that you provided, the time and effort into the PowerPoint presentation, and the questions that you've answered. Everything that you've said is going to help them immensely, and just thank you very, very much for coming today.
Thank you so much for watching. We really hope that this was helpful, and good luck with your HSC.